Super Mario Bros. Is often considered the first game with a plot, and for good reason. It popularized the concept of beating a game, whereas games prior were simply about achieving the highest score. With a plot comes characters worth caring about, and while it's simple now, the hero saves princess from dragon narrative laid the groundwork for so many later games. Only, that isn't actually the groundwork. Since every character has its inspirations, our team and our Patreon voters thought it might be interesting to look at some of the more notable characters that predate our favorite trio. Keep in mind the distinction between character and avatar here. Just because the square from Adventure is presumably a person, doesn't mean that they had a realized personality in the same way that Mario, Bowser, and Peach did. The first that would qualify as a character, I think, would probably be Eliza from all the way back in 1964, which is really more of a computer program than a game. Similar to the Cleverbot or Alexa of today, Eliza would respond to a user's inputs. Sort of. Rather than truly understanding what the user was saying, she would endlessly ask questions, both as a parody of Rogerian psychotherapy and as a demonstration of the limitations of interactions between man and machine. She's not very smart, but at the same time she actually convinced many early users that an actual human was crafting her responses, despite the creator's insistence otherwise. These days, she mostly comes across as dismissive and barely listening, but her dialogue's fairly entertaining regardless. Later interactive fiction would repurpose Eliza's smarmy attitude for their parsing systems, which probably works out a lot better. Widely considered the world's first adventure game, for obvious reasons, Adventure would show signs of this even in 1976. For example, if you typed "look at self" in, you'd get the response, "as good looking as ever." Outside of that, the game was intended as a substitute for creator William Crother's love of caving as he got on in years. And I'd say that for the time, Adventure was decently successful at that. But for the rest of us, it can be a bit wordy and empty feeling. In the early 80s, you saw the emergence of the first mascot characters. The personality and cartoon antics of Pac-Man, Frogger, Qbert, and Donkey Kong was a big reason for their widespread appeal, which would even net all of them a TV show together called the Saturday Supercade. Pac-Man's cutscenes are considered the first ever in gaming, adding a comical side to the character. Though I think that Miss Pac-Mans are just a lot cuter and do a better job of telling a story of the romance between the two Pac people. Donkey Kong Jr. gave us one of the first narrative twists through sequels, with the titular heroic ape saving his previously villainous papa from the suddenly dastardly Jumpman. Qbert's innovative digitized speech conveys some cuteness, though its nonsense alien words can only say so much. A year later, the release of Sinistar would do it one better and make a legitimately threatening villain, almost entirely sold by the voice acting's cries of "Beware, I live," and "Run, coward." Simple, but effective. Another commonality around this time was the move toward high fantasy as a setting. This was likely a direct result of the popularity of Lord of the Rings and Dungeons & Dragons amongst programmers, and you'd see a lot of similar elements between them. Wizard and the Princess, Ultima, and Wizardry would all have their own evil wizard, though none would get much development in-game. There's also a jester that you kill in Ultima that might have served as a base inspiration for Kefka, and of course, Lord British. British actually gains something of a meta-narrative while making fun of the English accent of one of his creators. And by being nearly indestructible in every Ultima game, players would make a sort of game within a game, trying to figure out what exploits could be used to kill him. By 1983, I think characters were fully realized and wouldn't seem out of place today, though some may come off as a bit flat. The Portopia serial murder case, one of the first mystery adventure games and a forerunner to the visual novel, featured a soft-spoken twist villain that killed out of revenge for his parents' suicide. Dragon's Lair would feature gorgeous animation by Don Bluth that expanded the character of Dirk the Daring into a bumbling, but ultimately brave hero that stumbles his way through death after death. Meanwhile, Princess Daphne's voice actress just has so much fun playing up the exaggerated sex appeal of the character. It's impossible to take seriously, but ultimately hilarious. Also, there was a Dragon's Lair cartoon and Singe the Dragon.
You have no doubt come to tell me that Ethelred's kingdom is mine.
Oh, it's so good. 1983 would also see the release of Planetfall, an adventure game featuring Floyd the Robot, a character who had one of the first real arcs in gaming. He's a rather annoying, childlike robot that constantly warns you to play with him and fumbles into the room. But players developed a bond with him regardless because some of his attributes were endearing. For example, he'd sometimes nuzzle you affectionately, and every time you saved the game, he'd break the fourth wall with an, "Oh boy, are we going to try something dangerous now?" Anyway, at the beginning of the game, he happily brings up Lazarus, another robot that you find the remains of later. Outside of making Floyd sad, this serves as a little bit of foreshadowing for, spoilers I guess, Floyd's own sacrifice, getting you a card that you need in order to beat the game from a group of mutants that tear him to shreds. You have a tearful goodbye with him and everything, and while I don't think it's aged that gracefully, at the time it legitimately had players in tears. He's rebuilt at the end and that kinda ruins it, but the fact that they were willing to even try to form an emotional bond that early is commendable, I think, and would lead to greater things in the future. And that brings us back to Mario. Not to sell Mario's accomplishments short, but honestly, at least at the time, I'd call Dragon's Lair a much more successful telling of the hero saves princess from dragon story. And we'd already had fairly deep character motivations and arcs by that point, not to mention cutscenes, voice acting, and other cartoon mascots. Mario is a mix of all of these elements more than he was a conscious decision to bring stories to gaming. And while I love the guy, he's more the codifier of character than he is any sort of originator. Ultimately, like all characters, Mario is a product of the time and culture around him, a culture that's better off not forgotten. Mario may have brought the industry back from the brink of total collapse, but he did so not on the shoulders of heroes, villains, or bosses, but characters that let him pave the way for gaming's future.